We're going to get back to solving multi-step equations. We are now on part 2, so you should have watched part 1 already, and now we're going to move on to part 2. We just have a few more examples of some different types of multi-step equations. One being using the distributive property, one we're going to have some fractions, and then we are going to look at a few word problems that we need to read and analyze and be able to pull out the important information and write our equation in order to solve it. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with this first example. We've talked about the associative and commutative properties where we can change order, we can change grouping, and in part 1 video we did have a few cases where we needed to change the order of our problems. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at a couple of examples of using the distributive property, which is usually pretty simple for most everyone. Distributive property is pretty popular. So I've got 12, and then in parentheses I have 3 minus x, and all of that's going to equal 60. So if I wanted to read this, this is the product of 12 and the difference of 3 and x. So 3 minus x, then times 12. So clearly we have a number attached to a parentheses here, and this you need to recognize when it's right here next to the parentheses. This is a multiplication problem. So what you need to automatically visualize, the reason why I tell you to use the distributive property on this is because when you look at a problem, an equation like this, and you see a number next to the parenthesis, now what you have to be very careful of is that there's not some type of operation here like a plus, subtraction, something like that. If there's nothing here, this is understood to be a multiplication problem. So being able to analyze that and say, I know this is distributive property because I am multiplying the inside of this parenthesis by 12. That's what we see there. So what I need you to do is go ahead and set up your distributive property here. So what we're going to do, we're going to distribute 12 to the 3. So just simply multiply 12 times 3, and that gives you 36. When you distribute, that is multiplication. And then multiply 12 times a negative x. And you may say, well, I can't multiply 12 and x. They're not like terms. And in a sense, you are correct because they are not like terms. But you're actually multiplying the coefficient of x by 12. And so this isn't understood, and this is again something that I'm telling you, but you need to be able to visualize every time you do these problems. This is an understood 1. That is a negative 1x. So what you need to be able to do is just multiply your 12 times the coefficient here, which is negative 1, and you're going to get negative 12x, because that x is part of that term. Alright, and so we're finished with your distributive property there, and this equals 60. And so now we have, after using the distributive property, we now have a two-step equation. Now, the two-step equation is a little bit backwards from what we're used to seeing on some of the other ones we did in previous videos. What you have to be extremely careful of is, yes, there is a subtraction sign here, but we're not subtracting 36. We are subtracting 12x. So when you're trying to determine the inverse operation, you're not going to look at what's behind this 36, even though we are starting with addition and subtraction because you're supposed to use order of operations in reverse. The negative here, or this subtraction, is actually with your term 12x, negative 12x. So what we need to do is we need to go to the front of this 36. And since there's nothing here, this is understood to be a positive 36. So thinking in reverse, the inverse of positive 36 would be a negative 36. And again, what we talked about in the last video, if I subtract 36 from this side, then I have to go all the way over past this equal sign to the other side and subtract 36 from there as well. Now, what you should always do is make sure that you don't just automatically mark these out. You should actually either do the subtraction or addition or whatever the operation is in your head, or use your calculator. What happens often is that people will have the wrong operation here, but then just assume that they've done everything correctly and just automatically mark it out. You should never assume. You want to make sure, double check your answer, make sure you've done the process correctly before you move on. Now this is a positive 36 and we're subtracting 36, so we are good there. That is a 0. And again, this negative that we were talking about is attached to this term 12x. So you have to make sure that when you bring down the rest of your equation here, that you do not lose the negative sign on your 12x. And then now over here I have a simple subtraction problem set up vertically there. So you just have to do 60 minus 36, and that gives you 24. So now we're down to a one-step equation, and all we have to do with this now is just divide both sides by negative 12. The negative 12 is attached to this x by multiplication, so the inverse is to divide both sides by negative 12. A negative divided by a negative, very important to remember. A negative divided by a negative, this gives you a positive, which is what you're going for. You must have a positive variable. And then 12 divided by 12 does give you 1. So we're left with our 1x equals, and 24 divided by negative 12 is negative 2. Alright, so what I want you to do right now is I want you to write down this problem. 18 equals 3 times the quantity 2x minus 6. I'd like for you to pause the video and take a moment to solve this equation. Alright, hopefully you paused this video and you've got your answer now for x. We're going to go through this process a little bit quicker than we did the first example there, but you should know, you should have looked at this problem and said to yourself, alright, this is a 3 outside of this parenthesis. It's attached by multiplication because there's not a sign there in between, so that means I'm going to distribute. So if I distribute my 3 in, I'm going to write my 18 equals here. 3 times 2x gives me 6x, and then 3 times, now be very careful here, you want to make sure that you're careful with your sign. This is a positive 3 times a negative 6. You do have to carry the sign that's in front of the number. So 3 times negative 6 gives you negative 18. And so we're down to our two-step equation. Negative 18 or minus 18, going in the reverse of order of operations and using the inverse operation, that would be a positive 18 or plus 18. Those are interchangeable terms there. So I'm going to add 18 to both sides. So on the left hand side here I do have 18 plus 18, which gives me 36. Equals, and then over here always double check yourself, but I do have a negative 18 plus 18. You could read it the other way, positive 18 minus 18, and again that is going to give you 0, so you're good there, and so you're left with 6x. And then finally, since you have 6 times your x, the inverse operation would be to divide by 6. So 36 divided by 6 leaves you with 6. 6 divided by 6 leaves us with our positive 1, which is what we need, x. So solving equations using the distributive property. Alright, so now what I want to do is I want to look at one with fractions. So let's take a look at this problem here. 3x over 4 minus x over 8 equals 5. Now since right now what we're dealing with are equations with one variable, so we're just dealing with x or just s or just r, or whatever the variable is in our equation. And this is going to be a little bit easier, but eventually we're going to get into equations where some of the variables are actually in the denominator, and so you're going to have to know how to find the common denominator like you did when just adding simple fractions without a calculator. So in this case though, because we just have the x's, we can actually do this a little bit easier, especially if you have a calculator. So right here where you have 3x over 4, you can actually manipulate this equation a little bit and change it a little bit. You can always slide this x off the top. Now the only reason why you can do that is because this is a multiplication problem. This is just one term in the numerator, and this term has a multiplication problem. So 3x over 4 can actually be written as 3/4 x. Just another way to view that. That way you can clearly see that the coefficient of x is 3/4. And then over here, this is just an x, and a lot of people will say, well, I just have an x. Well, that's true, but there is a coefficient to this x. Remember, we discussed that a while ago. It exists. That means there's one of them there. You have one x there in your numerator. So this would be minus 1/8 x equals 5. So what we have here is actually just like terms, just like we've had in some of the other problems we've looked at. These are like terms. They both have the variable x. The coefficients there are 3/4 minus 1/8. So we can go ahead and do 3/4 minus 1/8 in our calculator, and that will give us 5/8 x equals 5. Now this goes back to the last video where we discussed there's two different ways that you could solve this. Since you're multiplying by 5/8, you could divide both sides by 5/8, or the other option would be to multiply both sides by the reciprocal. And that's actually what I'm going to choose to do here. I'm going to multiply this side of my equation by the reciprocal of 5/8, which is 8 over 5. Therefore, I have to multiply the other side of my equal sign by the reciprocal 8 over 5. Now multiplying by the reciprocal, this does give you 1, and if you need me to mark both those numbers out there so you can see that, but 8 over 8, 5 over 5 will give you 1, so you are left with 1x equals, and then 5 times 8 over 5 is going to give you 8. So solving equations with fractions. So you want to make sure, not really any more difficult than when you just have whole numbers as coefficients. You just have to be careful and know how to manipulate your fractions if you need to, so that you can clearly see your coefficients, and then obviously make sure you use the correct operations to combine them and move them to the other side of the equation. Since we're running a little long in this video, we're going to go ahead and have a third part to multi-step equations, but it's just going to focus on a word problem for you to try, and then we will have the summary at the end of that third video. So go ahead, make sure you understand these problems here that you've seen in this video, and move on to video number 3 on multi-step equations, which will be over solving equations, setting up and solving equations from word problems.